Hello, it's Monday, friends. I know that is your absolute favorite day of the week. It's mine too. Monday. I'm not going to do it. I know we don't like the jokes. I hope you guys had a great weekend. We're back at it again. We're going to be taking a look at something exciting today. So buckle your seatbelts because here we go. So you know who I am. It's Miss Hitch. I'm out of Northern Virginia, TJ, all those things. And today we're going to be taking a look at two components. I'm going to have to kind of like fast talk us through them. And then I'm going to come around over the next week and try to really cement that concept for us. But it is selective incorporation and how we interpret the gun rights debate in America. So we're talking about the Second Amendment. Yeehaw, let's get going. All right. So, executive privilege, how far does that go? So if we wanted to know more about executive privilege, my friend Brock, we would go to the first place I would have you go to is US v. Nixon. So US v. Nixon, in the decision that's handed down by the courts, they put 4 conditions for executive privilege. And they have to do with kind of confidential internal discussions, ongoing investigations, things that relate to national security, and kind of, internal conversations that are personal-ish to some extent. And that last one, where you really want to go check out US v. Nixon because they give you a much better description in terms of what the courts mean by executive privilege. Prior to that, where does it come from? Well, it's an outgrowth of the necessity for secrecy that is discussed by Hamilton in 78. And we see the first instances of executive privilege being used is actually going to be in the Washington administration. So it is something that it's kind of a natural, informal outgrowth of the powers that are expressed by the president. As for the Energy Task Force case, I'm going to put that on hold and come back to that another day because I still have to do some homework on that one. So the next question is, can we copy certain phrases from a foundational document word for word in our argument essay? And I think we're talking about really, really small, like 4 or 5 word things. My answer to that is I am cautious when it comes to writing these FRQs. And so the advice that I give my own students is to avoid it. Just find a way to like change it up a little bit. Property distribution, inequality, or something along those lines where we still know that you're talking about a particular thing, but it's not necessarily geared towards the actual language that comes out of that document. Reason why we want to make sure that we're doing that is because we do not want to have any accusations or any instances of getting flagged. And so that'll reduce it. I mean, like we're not really changing much there, but we're taking care of being responsive to the content without putting ourselves in harm's way. So hopefully that helps you out, JD. Okay, so we looked at this over the weekend. This is a prompt about the EpiPen maker Mylon. This is an original prompt that goes back to the rewrite in 2019. And so we're going to roll through this really quickly. I feel like we are doing a really good job at starting to click through knowing how to do the identify, describe, explain in A, B, and C, even if it's not in the prompt. Again, we're making sure that we're doing more work to ensure we get that point. And again, I want to re-emphasize this from my experience as a reader to help you as a student understand where I'm coming from. When College Board is reading your answers, we have a very specific thing that we're looking for. It's usually a concept and it's somehow that concept is interrelated with another one or a different actor or something along those lines. And when you're looking at the scoring guidelines, they seem like we're looking for it seems like College Board is looking for a very short single sentence answer. However, that might be the case, but the likelihood of you getting that single answer, not knowing at your seat what it is that College Board is kind of geared at, that's a really dangerous proposition to write as little as possible. I'm counseling you to do more than that because every single word that you put on the page increases the likelihood that either you will specifically hit the concept on the head, or you will describe it sufficiently that the point will be on the page. So just remember, like, every single word that goes on that page is increasing the likelihood that you're getting the scoring guidelines requirements. It seems weird because I'm telling, with identify, you're underlining, with describe, you're telling me about the parts, or you're painting me a picture in words. With the explain, you're showing me interrelatedness, process, why, and how. And that's a lot of writing. Don't lose sight of the fact that it's almost impossible. I think in the 4,000 essays that I've read over in 2 years back to back, the likelihood of a student getting that answer perfect in one line, it's maybe like 3 or 4 essays. It doesn't happen. And it's it's to your benefit to write more, right? It's just to your benefit. So with that in mind, I pulled this one down. This is a beautiful FRQ. The student really walked through to make sure that they were identifying, describing, and explaining in each of the parts. 15 minutes, fill that whole time with typing. So their answer here to A, and I'm going to go back and forth. A is describe a power that Congress could use. So they are going to identify, describe, and explain. In order to address the recent hike of the auto injector by EpiPen and Mylon, very nice, we're framing our response with specific content that comes from the prompt, which is what I want you to do. Here's a recommendation. Congress could use its power to legislate, period. If I just got that, that's identify. Now they're going to go on to describe by writing and voting on legislation that limits the price of the auto injector under the Commerce Clause. They're describing the process. Now they're going to tell me why that would work. It allows Congress to regulate the price of the drug as it is sold and produced across state lines. It's perfect. I mean, we've got all three in how many sentences there? In 2 sentences, right? Identify, describe, and explain. Going back to B, in the context of the scenario, explain how the use of congressional power in A can be affected in its interaction in the presidency. Kind of one of the things that's shaking loose here is making sure that you've got the right actor that you are examining. So make sure you slow down. And here, the operative actor is the presidency. And what can the presidency do to influence something that Congress is doing? So they go through and they say conditional. If Congress passes legislation, they're referencing what they put up in the A, putting in some context from the prompt by saying that limits the price of the auto injector. This use of power could be limited depending on congressional action with the presidency. So what I see there is a very nice repetition of the prompt. Why would we want to do that? It seems like we're wasting time there. We're not. It's so important that you restate that question as a statement to ensure that you're really telling yourself, this is what I have to answer. As you're going through those 15 minutes and you're typing or writing, you are going to have to like read it out loud and say, okay, what am I answering? And the very act of writing it out on paper cements in your mind what it is that you're getting at in that question. It's rewording that question so that you understand it. That's a help for you. And I'm going to tell you, I recommend you doing it, right? So they go on to say, in order for this bill to become a law, the president must sign off on it, right? There it's not, bill signing is a part of Article 1, Section 7. Could they say Article 1, Section 7? Yeah, but like I understand that they understand the process enough by saying he has to sign off on it. It's not the most perfect word choice, but I definitely see that a bill is being signed, right? So it is likely that Congress's interest in providing affordable drugs to their constituents would have to match the president's agenda. That's actually an explain, right? So we know what they're doing and we know why that controls them, right? But now they have to go into that description, and they do that by saying the bill could become a law or a veto depending on the president's of ideological belief, et cetera, et cetera. And they're spreading out further, laying down spare tires about ideological belief. Is that something that has to be on there? No. But what are they doing? They're flexing that they know the content, and I love it. Do that, like flex that you know that content. Fully think out your response to the full extent. All right, so then we go to C. C wants to know in the context of the scenario. So still we're framing it with specifics from the stimulus. Explain how the interaction between Congress and the presidency can be affected by linkage institutions. Here, we are going to say the president congressional interaction involved in the process of a bill becoming a law, restating the prompt, can be affected by linkage institutions. Very nice. I know what we're answering. Such as, here's our identify, interest groups and political parties. We know who we're talking about. There was a prompt that I read last week that was for this essay, and the student had forgotten. They like kind of didn't identify who they were talking about until in their explain point. And I told them, I have to draw conclusions about who you're talking about if you're not crystal clear up front, because it would almost be like just saying they didn't say such as interest groups and political parties. If they just kind of went on and said linkage institutions, describe what they were, and then they said like political parties, you're going through that entire process, and I'm still like, which one are we talking about? Like linkage institutions, that's a concept. It's not a specific thing. I need to see a specific thing. So it might feel clunky, but again, get that identify cemented in that first sentence, clarify who it is the subject of your response, so that in the reader's mind, there's no hesitation. There's no drawing of inferences about who we're discussing. So interest groups are funded by pharmaceutical companies, which have an interest in higher drug prices, would attempt to insert itself between Congress and the president to prevent this bill from coming law. That's a great description, right? It's telling me who's involved, etc. Now they need to tell me why it would work, right? So through the use of negative advertisements and its relationship as a potential fundraiser for the president, special interest can attempt to dissuade the president from signing the bill. Beautiful. Then they put down a spare tire and they go on to talk about political parties, but they've already got the point. So I hope what we're seeing here again is that by repeating the prompt, by identifying the subject of your response, by describing the parts of that answer and showing me how that interworks with something else, you are increasing the likelihood that you are getting all of those parts. And remember, College Board has said some of these responses are going to require a describe and explain. You're going to see multiple verbs. So you have to do both in order to earn that point. Even though I'm telling you to do identify and describe and explain, you should be doing all of them on all 3 points, because you never just get into the habit, right? If we're going really fast and part B has describe and explain, or part C has describe and explain, and you miss the verb, it won't matter, because we've got the muscle memory of doing identify, describe, and explain on all 3 parts. It's our insurance policy. We love insurance policies. Okay. Wonderful. Let's turn into our concept for today. I'm just making sure I'm watching my time. So we're on the Second Amendment. And I know that we are all really familiar with the language of the Second Amendment, but I want to put it up here for a minute because it's such an odd statement. And that oddity should have us pause for a second and wonder, why is it phrased like this? Why doesn't it just say the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed? If we had that, if we got rid of the top two clauses, this would be a universal guarantee that all citizens would have the right to keep and bear arms, and the federal government could not trespass. But that's not what it says. It says a well-regulated militia. So it's a conditional phrase here. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This sidestep, this clause that's conditional, that's inserting into the equation some action or some necessity of the state, is the root of all of our controversy over guns in America. So let's dig into it deeper, shall we? Okay. We've already talked about government and guns. We talked about them with Lopez. Remember, Lopez, if we go back, Lopez is a case, it's a federalism case. We talked about the Gun-Free School Zones Act, right? Remember all those things? And when we walked out of that case, what we left with is that it wouldn't be appropriate for you to talk about the right to individuals to bear arms, or the right for the states to be able to regulate that ownership. It's really a case that deals with, can the federal government intrude and regulate the gun market on the use of the Commerce Clause? It's a case that looks at how the federal government operates. So for that reason, that case, we're really going to associate it primarily here with our federalism issues. So the Commerce Clause, right? And we know that the Commerce Clause has had these waves of expansion in terms of how it's been interpreted over time to include well beyond just point of sale, you and I exchanging commodities for one with each other, right? It's expanded beyond that. I talked to you guys about one of my favorite documents, James Madison's Vices, where he talked about the interruption of our economy by the states, by not adhering to treaties, by putting huge taxes on each other's imports and exports, and thereby kind of getting in the way of this really weird phrase, but you'll never forget it, called commercial intercourse, right? And what does that mean to us? It's like this commercial interaction. We talked about how that phrase is cited when we look at Gibbons v. Ogden, when we look at other cases, it's frequently cited, this idea of extending commerce beyond point of sale, right? It's about supply chains, it's about who's doing the labor, it's about regulating safety in the workplace, it's about regulating ownership of things, of access to materials, of commodities, all kinds of things. So much of what the government does today is rooted in these expansive interpretations of the Commerce Clause. And so for that reason, it can get really murky when we're taking a look at something like the Second Amendment. We really have to stop and think, well, who's doing what, and which part of this, equation of nation, state, and person are we looking at as it relates to guns? So in order for us to understand this a little bit further, I'm going to have to take us down a slide from federalism to this concept known as selective incorporation. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a warning here. This is typically the most complicated concept in our course. I have a friend who's a constitutional law professor, and when we talked about selective incorporation, he was incredulous that I was teaching this to high school seniors. He said, "I didn't learn about this until I was in law school. Why are you teaching this in high school?" And my answer was, well, because why not? I mean, we can. And I think if we can understand it and explain it in a way that helps us see the interaction of federal and national government, it makes a heck of a lot more sense when we're talking about any of these rights that you and I hold that are enumerated in the Bill of Rights. So let's slide down this rabbit hole. First foundation for us. Remember, we've seen this so many times that when we take a look at kind of these two basic fundamental differences of interpretation that are rooted in the Constitution, we have this propensity for decentralized localities, preferences of powers. We see it in the 10th Amendment. We see it in the quote unquote states' rights movement. All of those different kinds of, catchphrases that we see thrown around, all of them tend to root that power closer to the individual through localities. Whereas if we're looking in the opposite direction, we're looking towards more centralized national entities where the individual's rights are going to be cemented by this universal interpretation of these rights. And the courts are actively involved in this. We talked about judicial federalism and how controversial it got. When we looked at judicial federalism, I talked to you about the Warren Court and how many cases the Warren Court handed down that fundamentally altered the ability of the community to be able to set standards for things as varied as what constitutes trial by jury, to representational issues and gerrymandering and redistricting, to knowing your rights when you've been accused of a crime, to ensuring that all people have access to equality and education and beyond. So there's so many different avenues that we walk down, and a lot of it pivots on these different clauses that we're going to pull out of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that are frequently involved, right? So we talked about Lopez. Again, we know that this comes back to Commerce Clause. I should have put this earlier, but it's nice to connect back to it because it helps us remember that this is a case about federalism, not the case when we're looking at other issues. So there is a case I'm going to talk to you about today called McDonald v. Chicago that doesn't deal with the national government. It's really a decision that's looking at the relationship between citizen and state when it comes to gun ownership. But before we get there, we have to understand what this process is, because I've told you that on July 4th, 1776, it's kind of like we went into a state of nature. In reality, there was the moment that we declared independence, we were in a quote unquote anarchy. There was no government structure. It didn't feel like it. I would imagine that not much changed between July 4th and July 5th, 1776. But the Constitutional Convention, I'm sorry, not the Constitutional Convention, oh, now I can't think of it, you guys. What is the Committees of Correspondence? The Second Continental Congress. There we go. They had told the states to be prepared, and they had sent out messages where they said, get your house in order. You need to have a fundamental system of government in place because this is something that's going to be happening. And so they did. And the first thing that happened in most of these states was they crafted what we would call a Bill of Rights. They might have had a different name for it, but it's same, right? And the first thing they wanted to do was they wanted to say the government cannot intrude on these various collections of rights. And that state Bill of Rights was a contract between the state and the person. So we're there, right? Then the next thing that happens is we create the Articles of Confederation. It's our first written constitution. It's a confederal system. It's going to keep power in the hands of the states. They're going to share minimal amounts of powers to the national government. It doesn't need to have a Bill of Rights because really it's bound by each state's sovereign interpretation of the rights that are enumerated in each state's bills of rights. All right. So we don't need a national one because every state has their own, and they are all going to be restraining because power is in the state. It's not in the center. Then we go to the Constitution. And as you know, the Madisonian system of government, the theory that was in place there by Madison and his friends was that bills of rights are not necessary. They are paper chains, that if you have a tyrant, they will slide right past it. They will burst through that paper chain, and they will continue to abuse the people because they are equipped with too much power at the center. And that's what you should be concerned about, is how power is distributed and restrained in a system of government, not that you have these guarantees, these contractual obligations that at any point in time can be ignored. Remember, the King of England had a contractual obligation with all citizens in the colonies through the English Bill of Rights, which was written in 1689. And the king and the crown and parliament just walked right through that, right? They just went right through the door because they had exigent circumstances. So we are going to see the crafting of the Federal Bill of Rights as written and ratified as a way to kind of prevent there from being another constitutional convention. We see that as a way to silence the most pervasive critiques of the United States Constitution. But in this point, you have two distinct enumerations of rights of the individual, and they are separate from each other, right? So the Fifth Amendment, we have this general claim. We look to due process rights as an overarching way of describing all of the legal rights that are provided for us throughout the amendments in the Bill of Rights, right? So the first 10. So when we think of due process of law, we would put under that umbrella things like a fair and speedy trial, a ban on cruel and unusual punishment, the right to question your accusers, the right to representation in court, all of those things. That's due process. Those are legal processes due to you as a citizen. But all of those things, as they are spelled out and then interpreted by the federal courts, they are left only at the federal level. The only government that's impacted by those interpretations by the Supreme Court are federal agencies. That's it. You're dealing with the courts, and if you're doing something where you're charged with something at the state level, you are going to have to look to whatever the state's interpretation of their own Bill of Rights may be. Now, it might be that you would find, for instance, that Virginia and the United States have very similar rights, and by 1850 there's a large alignment where the rights are pretty much the same. But the interpretations through precedent and through stare decisis have diverged. So there's, in a very real way, completely different ways of understanding what you are owed when you're interfacing with any government. So the most kind of rational way, or the easiest way for us to approach this, would be, think about when if someone is arrested, we know exactly what's going to be said to them at the time of arrest. You have a right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have a right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed to you. That is a right that comes from the national government, that comes from the courts, but it comes because of this process known as selective incorporation. Prior to that, what all of that means, that you have the right to an attorney, well, under what conditions? What kind of a crime are we talking about? Is it a felony crime? Is it a capital case? Is it a misdemeanor? Is it some kind of thing below that? Like, do you get to have the right to an attorney? What if you can't afford one? All of those things, if you're dealing with a state agency, if you're dealing with a state law enforcement officer, would be a different standard than the national. And if you're confused, if you're like, oh God, like, I don't understand, a very simple way is this. You would have to know, as if you were interfacing with a law enforcement officer, you would have to kind of have a running list of all of the rights and what they mean depending on which level of government you're interfacing with. There was no universalness to it. And if you're moving from state to state, not only do you have to know the federal government's interpretation, but now you need to know every other state that you're going to's interpretation so that you can be ensured of your rights. It makes it complicated for citizens to know and to hold the government accountable to what our rights are, because there's so many different interpretations, and it's this labyrinth that people get lost in. What changes this is there's a clause in the 14th Amendment that is very, very similar to the 5th, right? And that is that the state shall not deprive any person of life, liberty, and property without due process of law. They're highlighted in blue there. Do you see it? I call that a bridge. What it does is that language, because it runs parallel, the biggest difference being the Fifth Amendment is a limitation on the federal government. The 14th Amendment is a limitation on state governments. What the courts did was they took that parallel language and they linked it. They put a bridge between them. And they said that because they're so similar, and there's evidence that I'm going to get to in a minute that this was intentional. Like, it wasn't just like they're like, oh, hey, I didn't know it looked the same. Let's do this crazy thing. But it's an intentional linking so that states couldn't create separate but not necessarily parallel interpretations of natural rights. Now, this would make sense if we understand that natural rights supersede our government because they come from a creator and they are given to every single human being. So it would only make sense that we would want them to be parallel and in tandem, that we would want them to be universal, so that whatever you expect to see in terms of rights from the federal government versus what you would expect to see when you're confronting the government of Nevada or of North Dakota or Nebraska or North Carolina or New York, that it's all the same. Right? It's all the same. So this allows us to create that bridge between those two documents so that states cannot be selective in how they want these things to affect people. That's a critically important component. It's people. So that is citizens and non-citizens. It's any person who is in business or who is interacting with the federal or state governments. And that process, again, is called selective incorporation. Now, if I'm going really fast, I'm going to take a time out. I'm going to tell you that today in the in the materials down below, linked down below, I have a video that goes through this in much more detail so that you can go back, you can watch this again, and you can watch that video too to help you understand selective incorporation. I take a slightly different route. It's more historical and less theoretical. Okay, so the 14th Amendment, there's a couple other things I want to make sure that I unpack that we're going to build on later this week. The first thing is that when we look at the clauses in the 14th Amendment, when we're looking at we're looking at the 14th Amendment, the first article, that there is also this really weird thing called privileges and immunities. And I explain this to my students as these are gifts. According to the Supreme Court, they are things that you are given by the states. So they're things like being able to attend in-state college for a reduced tuition. Why? Because you paid taxes. They are things like being able to ride on roads. They are things like being able to have a license, a driver's license. They are things like being able to have a teacher's license. All of these things are privileges and immunities. They're gifts from the state that they elect to give you. And how do they elect to give it to you? Through the democratic process. The second clause is that due process. And that due process, again, are all of those legal processes that are owed to you, which we have enumerated, we've listed out in amendments 1 through 9. And we shouldn't confuse that with the final component of this amendment called the Equal Protection Clause, which is a clause that enables the courts to ensure that all citizens who are classified in a suspect manner, and that is a way of looking at it as like discriminatory. The states are they're always making classifications. Case in point, they're classifying, if you're looking to go to an in-state school, they're classifying you as a state citizen, but somebody who comes from out of state as a non-state citizen. So that's a classification, and that's totally legal. It's perfectly fine, right? What is suspect has to do with things like race and religion and things of that nature, where they're core rights that you hold, or there are things that you cannot change because they are bestowed upon you by the creator. So this idea of equal protection is a way to ensure that the governments of the states and then the federal government, because we do this process called reverse incorporation, that we're holding them accountable to not placing suspect classifications on individuals and thereby limiting things that they have access to. We're going to talk about equal protection clause a ton on Friday. This is another thing that's in that folder for you. It's kind of like a timeline that shows you the progression that we go through the incorporation doctrine that you can have as a pullout, but it also mirrors that video that I left there for you. Now, I told you that this process was intentional. It's not like the justices were like, oh my God, here we go. We have this really cool language and it looks like what we see in the 14th Amendment. Oh no, this was intentional. This is the second founding. And there's some really, really radical things that are happening at this time in Congress that are restructuring that relationship between the government. And they're adding somebody to the equation of national versus community. And that thing that they're adding is the individual. So now we have this understanding that the individual is now a very critical component to making decisions about what we do as a government. John Bingham is the author of the 14th Amendment. He's the daddy. He is very much so a revolutionary in the way that he looks at things, along with Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. Those individuals together worked to radically restructure this relationship and to give power to the national government to be able to intercede whenever states are doing something that jeopardizes individuals that they have classified somehow as a minority. Now, what are they talking about there? That suspect classification of race. So here's a really great quote that he says, what is due process of law? I love we come back to this idea. It's arbitrary abuse and the taking of life, confinement, and confiscation. Think about that, because it's threaded all throughout the Bill of Rights. We see this, right? He goes on, further evidence that this was an intentional action that was there to circumvent states when they are not giving people rights. He says that the state, he's talking about Missouri here, so this is taken out of context a bit, but what he really is getting at is it's never should be so enforced to deprive any citizen of the United States of the rights and privileges of a citizen of that United States within the limits of that state. And what we should really read that to be is of any state. No state should be depriving people of those rights and privileges. So Selective incorporation is the idea, I explain it as nationalization of our understandings of our rights through the courts. We have selectively incorporated right by right. The courts were faced with the idea of doing all of them at once, and they rejected it for various reasons that I don't need to go into. But just know that what they decided was that each one needs to be made, we need to make a determination on each right and whether or not the state is obligated to enforce upon itself the national understanding of whatever that right might be. And so here is our list of all of our selectively incorporated rights. Super fun. We had one this year with the unanimous jury for serious offense in 2020 with Ramos v. Louisiana. We had one in 2019 with Timms v. Indiana with no excessive fines. We will probably, there's two on here that you don't, three on here that you don't see that I would assume we probably never will see. Maybe grand jury indictment, but quartering of soldiers, I don't think we'll ever see that. That's something you typically see with trying to keep the government from forcefully being tyrannical towards people and requiring them to use property to support military troops like we had to during the American Revolution. I just don't foresee that at this point for various reasons. And the jury trial, probably never, because the jury trial requirement in the Constitution is $20 for a civil jury trial. And I don't think anybody wants to force a jury trial for matters of $20 or less, right? So like, we're just probably never going to see that. Okay. Some other things that fly out of this that I'll be working on developing is we can also group these a little bit different. So we talked about privileges and immunities in our first clause. That's things like right to move, right to access courts, right to employment, and property rights. Those are rights and privileges. Those are gifts given by the state, and they can be given and taken away. Procedural and substantive due process. Procedural has to do with process, right? So we're thinking about how do they go about finding evidence against you to accuse you of doing something wrong. We're talking about the process of going through trial. We're talking about the process of punishing someone. Those are procedural in nature. Substantive has to do with material things, right? So freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of conscience, all of these things are substantive due process rights. And finally, we come to equal protection, which I'm going to develop later on this week with the different government actions and laws that have been put in place to ensure that the government is not harming people when they're making suspect classifications. And we'll see more with this slide later. So you may be like, it's 3:37 and we still have not talked about regulating gun ownership. So let's get to this. There's two main options in terms of how we interpret the Second Amendment. The first one is collective. Collective rights go back way back to the beginning of our country. And actually both of them do. But the important thing for us to note here is that this was the prevailing interpretation prior to the 21st century, was this idea that the states, remember we had that weird clause about the states having to have a militia, that the states were allowed to maintain militias to prevent tyrannical interference from a national army, very much so referring back to Federalist 24. It allowed for the state to regulate individual access to firearms, and you can see it very prominently in cases like US v. Miller and US v. Cruikshank. Individual rights is a newer interpretation of this amendment. It puts in place, it instead of putting the primacy on collective rights, it puts on individual rights, which means that the right to possess firearms for the personal defense and defense of others is going to be more important. That's not to say that there's not a case for collective rights, just like when collective rights was in vogue, there wasn't a case for individual rights. It just means that this is the tendency that we see. You might see them in, and it's done through the selective incorporation of the Second Amendment through cases like District of Columbia versus Heller and McDonald v. City of Chicago. And there's actually a court case winding its way through the Supreme Court this year. So what we see here is a really nice juxtaposition. I'm just going to read this quote to you really quickly. I think they do a nice job at kind of encapsulating the issue here. So the original understanding of the Second Amendment was neither an individual right to self-defense nor a collective right to the states, but rather a civic right that guaranteed citizens would be able to keep and bear those arms needed to meet their legal obligation to participate in a well-regulated militia. Nothing better captured this constitutional idea than the Minutemen. Citizens had a legal obligation to outfit themselves with a musket at their own expense and were expected to turn out at a minute's notice to defend their community, state, and eventually their nation. Although each side in the modern debate claims to be faithful to the historical Second Amendment, a restoration of its original meaning, recreating the words of the Minutemen, would be a nightmare that neither side would welcome. It would certainly involve more intrusive gun regulation, not less. Gun control advocates might blanch at the notion that all Americans would be required to receive firearm training and would certainly look askance at the idea of requiring all able bodied citizens to purchase their own military assault style weapons. So it's complicated. That's what I want to leave you this with, is that when we're talking about this issue is rooted in history, right? We see very much so that some of the concerns from Brutus, for instance, Brutus talking about how despotic governments throughout Europe kept standing armies and they were at the commands of the magistrate, that is the government, and they are there to suppress, to use arbitrary force, to harm the people, and that no free republic could have that. Those are all things that we see from Brutus, right? However, we also see weird oddities throughout American history that maybe make us say, well, it wasn't like universal, right? Brutus is writing at a time where even in that time period, it's not like everybody could just have whatever they want. I mean, also on top of that, again, going back to how things change over time, it would be it would I'm not going to make a value judgment of what it would be, but certainly the argument that things have changed definitely gives us something else to chew on when we're talking about issues related to Second Amendment. We were talking about muskets and rifles and knives and tomahawks, things that required either hand-to-hand combat or would take more than a minute, maybe 30 seconds to reload single rounds. Today, we're not talking about that. We're talking about arms that can, depending on what it is, can be modified to be semi-automatic, can be automatic. Oh, I know automatic is illegal, but needless to say, the amount of defense that can be done with those weapons is certainly different. And I wanted to just point out to you again that while Brutus is concerned about a standing army being tyrannical, he's also living in a time period in which, number one, Bacon's rebellion and Shays' rebellion scared the living daylights out of the elitists who controlled our country. A populist protest of people taking up arms against their oppressors is terrifying. Now, Shays' rebellion, whether or not they were taking up arms, remains to be debated. But in Bacon's rebellion, there was arms being taken up. You also saw things like registration requirements in which white men between the ages of 16 and 60 had to be able, in order for militia service, had to record that they possessed arms. You saw bans on public carries in common law. You saw bans on loaded arms in homes throughout that time period because of the risk to injury and fire from having those things on the premises. You saw loyalty oaths that not anybody could have an arm at that time period, particularly during the Revolutionary War. You had to swear an oath to the revolutionary cause. And on top of that, access to arms for Black Americans was heavily restricted all throughout the period of enslavement in the antebellum South out of fear of a slave revolt like Nat Turner. And in addition to that, you also saw it during Jim Crow, in which it was legally codified that Blacks could not have arms for the same, very, very same reasons. And that would not change significantly until World War I and the enlistment of Black Americans to go fight abroad. That's where we'll start to see widespread change, widespread. Couple other points here, contemporaneous to the petition for Bacon's rebellion, you do see people who are protesting. They're saying, oh my gosh, like going back to Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and all of these individuals, they talked about the republic being free when people have arms to keep repressive, tyrannical, and arbitrary power in check. Right. And so that you see that there is somebody who is petitioning a grievance in James City County in Virginia back during the time of Bacon's rebellion, saying that they needed to have defense ammunition so that they could be secure in their possessions. And the answer was that Not every man gets to have them. This is a threat to public safety. Right? An entry from 1768 in Boston's Journal of the Times. You see another person making a very eloquent claim here that it's a natural right to have this restored to them, claimed by the Bill of Rights to keep arms for their defense, as Mr. Blackstone, who is a judge in England, observes, that this is required to keep and restrain violence of oppression. So if we come back around, and I know that I'm up against the time period here, so just give me a second and I'm going to adapt today's discussion so that you have something to walk out of here with. This is all a part of our larger understanding of what ordered liberty is. This is very much so rooted in things like natural rights, in things like limited government, in things like individualism, in things like rule of law. All of this is very much so an American conversation, because this one particular instance, history is not unequivocal. There are sides, there's a dearth of evidence for both sides, and they are both on both sides very compelling, interesting arguments to be had, right? You're talking about life, liberty, and property of one person versus life, liberty, and property of another, and they are constantly enmeshed in this debate, right? Adam Winkler, he writes this wonderful, eloquent essay called Scrutinizing the Second Amendment. He also wrote a very nice book about it. He talks about how no right is absolute, and the extent to which legislation can permissibly burden a right is largely determined by doctrinal rules, tests, and other devices the courts adopt to implement that right. And we are still going through that today, right? The flip side of it again, Nelson Lund comes back and he says, hey, but this is a right that we can't just play with, right? It might not be an absolute right, but it is something that is critical, that we shouldn't be dismissing it, that the text of the Constitution explicitly guarantees the right to bear arms, not just to keep them. First Amendment rights aren't confined to the home, and neither are those protected by the Second Amendment, nor should the government be allowed to create a burdensome bureaucratic obstacle that frustrates the exercise of these rights. Now, at this point, if you're like, I'm so confused, that's a good place to be, because what it shows is that you're grappling with the very real concerns that we have about a tyrannical and arbitrary government versus, which is liberty, versus the very necessary desire that we have to be in an organized society where we forfeit some of our rights so that we can go and pursue our happiness. And those, again, are very American issues. So I'm going to leave you with McDonald v. Chicago, which is our Second Amendment case, in which we're looking at selective incorporation, and you do need to know it for the test. It is something that is required. It's a required case. So you guys can read through this. I'm not going to like slow walk us through this because it's very much so spelled out. And I'm gonna say there's one interesting thing here. There's a strict scrutiny standard. If we had strict scrutiny, it would be the most difficult thing. Actually, I'm gonna pause and I'll come back around to strict scrutiny in a couple of classes, because I really want to develop this idea, but I don't have time. So maybe I'll bring it in tomorrow. I think it would be a really interesting conversation. So this was going to be the FRQ that I was going to do live today. I'm not going to have time to do it. So what I'm going to offer you the opportunity to do is to have choice. You can do this one, or you can do the one at the end, or you can do both, and you can send it to me on Twitter and I will give you feedback on both of them. I think I'm still going to take a stab at writing this tomorrow. But it is a really fun dissenting opinion from Justice Clarence Thomas. He has a really interesting view on these rights, but it's a great way for us to kind of tackle how we might be asked to look at cases in our content application. So here's our check for understanding today. In which of the following situations would the Supreme Court be most likely to utilize the doctrine of selective incorporation? Individual claims a right protected by Bill of Rights is infringed upon a state, conflict between branches of the national government, federal policy shifting authority, or former employee files a wrongful termination. Of course, it's A. And to which level of government did the Bill of Rights originally apply? I know you know this one. We don't even have to. It's B, federal government. Okay, We did all the things. We rushed it. I talked too long. Here is your other option in terms of things that you can attempt for your walkout today. I will put both of these. I have to put them back up online. I haven't gotten a chance to it. Cool opportunity that came by through quill.org. This is a partnership that is here, free online tools to help you with your writing skills. Remember, we've been talking about active versus passive voice and putting your verbs and putting your subject in front of your predicate and all that kind of stuff to clarify your writing. So go to quill.org/AP to get some help with your writing skills in advance of the test. I'm going to say thank you so much for watching today. So many things going on. Here are my resources. And guess what? That brings us to a close on this very, very complicated, very controversial topic in American politics, but I hope that you can see a through road back to really critical American values and some very important constitutional issues. And I will say goodbye to you for the evening, and we'll pick up where we left off tomorrow. Bye.